Okay, guys, let's look at question 3. There are 3 times as many students participating in the hiking trip this year than last year. There are 42 students on the trip this year. Explain how to find the number of students that came on the hiking trip last year. Okay, so for part A, they want us to figure out a way like, okay, how will we solve it on our own, right? Now, when I look at this problem, I initially think, well, if there are 42 students now this year and this is 3 times the amount last year, well, I want to divide it by 3, which I like dividing this way. Then I ask myself, well, how many times can 3 go into 4 one time? How many times could 3 go into 12? 4 times. And how many students was on the hiking trip that came last year? 14 students went on the hiking trip last year. Okay, let's move on to part B. It says, May says the equation 3s equals 42 describes the situation. What does the variable s represent? All right. Now, the question, right, is how many students went on a hiking trip last year? And that's exactly what that variable represents, is the number of students who went on a hiking trip last year. All right. Now, part C says, May says that she could rewrite the equation as S equals 1/3 times 42 to solve for S. Compares May's strategy to your strategy for finding the number of students on last year's trip. Okay, so let's look at our strategy, or my strategy that I did. I divided by 3. I divided 42 divided by 3. Now, if we was to attempt to do May's strategy, it would be, okay, 42 times 1/3. Okay, now if I did 42 times 1/3, I put a 1 underneath that whole number. Guess what that ends up looking like? 42 over 3, which looks like our answer, or my answer, or my strategy, the way we did before. So technically, dividing by a number is the same as multiplying by its reciprocal. This is called the multiplicative inverse, okay? This is called the multiplicative inverse, okay? All right, so I'll say that again. Dividing a number is the same as multiplying by its reciprocal. It doesn't matter if the number is a fraction or if the number is a whole number. Guess what? If you multiply it by its reciprocal, it's the same as dividing by the regular number, okay? Now let's look at question 4. It says the cost of a hiking trip this year is 2/3 of the cost of last year's trip. This year's trip cost $32. Write and solve an equation to find the cost of last year's trip. Okay, so what we don't know is the cost of last year's trip. Now, I don't want to use a T this time standing for last year's trip. I'm going to use a C. I'm going to use a C to represent the cost of last year's trip. Okay. Now, I know that when we was doing question 1 and 2, I was just thinking, I was like, maybe I didn't go into full details of how did I know how to put 21 behind the equal sign. All right. And I'm going to explain that. Okay. I was once told this, that all totals go behind the equal sign. Okay. So it said this year's trip cost $32. All right. So this will go behind the equal sign. Okay. Now they said that the cost of the hiking trip this year is 2/3 of the cost of last year. So they're saying that 2/3 of however much the trip cost last year is equal to $32. Okay? Now, in our first problem, which in question 3, we dealt with a whole number. We dealt with 3s. Well, this one we're dealing with a fraction as a coefficient, which a coefficient is the number that stands in front of the variable. All right? Now, we multiply by the reciprocal, and that's the same thing we want to do in this situation. We want to multiply by the reciprocal of 2/3, which would be 3/2. Okay? So I'm going to multiply 3/2 on one side and on the other side because equations crave balance. Okay? That's why they're called equations, because they have to be equal to each other. So 3/2 times 2/3 would give me 6/6c, which would, and I'm just breaking this step by step. All right. So when I multiply 32 times 3, let me double check. I should get 96/2. Okay. Now we want to simplify these fractions and so on. So 6/6 will equal to 1c, or we could write it like this, c. And then 96 divided by 2. Well, how many times can 2 go into 96? 2 could go into 96 4 times, which will give me 8. And then 2 could go into 16 8 times. So therefore, c will be equal to 48. And if we wanted to put our answer in terms of context of the terms of the situation, we could say last year's trip cost $48. Okay, I'm gonna put last year trip cost $48. Okay. So if you guys had any questions about the multiplicative inverse or the additive inverse, I highly encourage you guys to go visit your manager's Google Meet session. If you had any questions on even solving the equations or even setting up the equations, okay? Well, I hope you guys enjoyed this lesson today. I'll see you guys in the next lesson. Bye, guys.